اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم افتح علينا فتوح العارفين ووفقنا توفيق الصالحين وانفعنا بالقرآن والذكر الحكيم. اللهم انفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا بما ينفعنا وزدنا علما يقربنا منك برحمتك يا ارحم الراحمين. اللهم لا سهل الا ما جعلته سهلا وانت يا حي يا قيوم تجعل الحزن اذا شئت سهلا سهلا. اللهم اعذنا من شرور انفسنا ومن سيئات اعمالنا واصلح لنا شأننا كله لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم. وبعد، جزاكم الله خيرا. Brother Ubada, Sister Hadia, Sister Brother Talha, and the Muslim Society here for organizing and inviting me down. Jazakum Allah khairan. As Brother Ubada mentioned, first of all, could I just check, has anyone attended any of my previous lectures on any of these related topics? No? Good, okay. I just need to check if I could repeat the same jokes. Otherwise it will be a problem. Yeah, so I'm a medical doctor, obviously. I'm in psychiatry. I'm a registrar at the moment in psychiatry, and I took time out after my house jobs. I took out about over 7 years on and off. I spent 5 years, about 4 or 5 years in Syria, in Damascus. So alhamdulillah, I was completely out of medicine apart from doing a few occasional locum work at that time. So I really focused on getting training in the Islamic sciences. Alhamdulillah, so I studied with various different scholars, and at the end of that time they gave me ijaza, or a traditional type of qualification that you're now qualified to teach the various Islamic sciences. Today's session, originally was, I think it was supposed to be 2 hours, but we're going to cut it down to 1.5. And I realize you've had a long day, so I'm going to try to. It's actually quite a demanding subject, especially if you've not been exposed to this before. But we'll try and keep it sort of a bit light as possible, and go through things fairly briefly, and give more time for the discussion and the case studies, because I expect you're all very tired by this stage. Feel free at any time to shout out any questions, or raise your hand, or just shout out any questions as we're going along. I do advise people to go into psychiatry if they're interested, mainly because you'll end up with a very long string of letters after your name. So you'll have your MBBS and you'll have MRC Psych, MRC PSYCH, which is one of the longest string of letters you can possibly get. If you become a physician or a surgeon, you'll have MRCS or MRCP. So that's a good incentive if you want to boost your ego. But on the other hand, it might not be such a boost for your ego when you try to explain to your, if like me, you're from Pakistan or places like that, you try to explain to your parents or uncle or aunt what's a psychiatrist. You can imagine the sort of conversations you could have. Okay, so this particular course about Muslim medical ethics, which actually the foundations of Muslim medical ethics is no different to generally Muslim or Islamic ethics itself. So we'll whiz through some slides, inshallah. Like I said, I won't go into too much detail, but just ask, if you want to ask questions, please feel free. So what we're going to do today is look at Islamic medical ethics, right? And give an idea of what are the foundations of ethics in Islam, okay, as opposed to other ethical systems that you might find. So first of all, this is the outline of the slides that we're going to be going through. We'll look at a definition of Islamic medical ethics, history, and then the methodology will look at in quite some detail, which will involve looking at the sources and what we call priorities. These are priorities in Islamic law, and maxims. These are legal maxims or legal rules that underlie Islamic law or Sharia. As you'll find, Islamic medical ethics is very much linked up to Islamic law, or what's also known as Sharia, and also known as fiqh in the Arabic. And then we look at how we actually then give a fatwa. So when we have a question like Brother Ubaida mentioned about organ donation or about sterilization, for example, we have to tell the Muslim patient, is it permissible, is it haram, is it sometimes obligatory for you to do this thing, or is it recommended? The general ruling for, does anyone know what's the general ruling for seeing a doctor if you're ill? What would be the general ruling? Wajib? Any other opinions? So yes, so some scholars said it's wajib. The majority would have said it's mustahab or recommended to see a doctor. So if you're ill, to see a doctor, especially if it's a life-threatening situation, sometimes many jurists would then say it becomes wajib, obligatory to try to preserve life. But however, we know the case of Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, when he was in his final illness, and people came to, the people around him said to him, we'll bring you the best doctor, just give us the word. And he said, the doctor has seen me, and he said, I'll do as I wish. So obviously referring to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he didn't actually see a doctor. So because of that incident, the jurists had quite extensive discussions. Is it actually wajib? Can we actually say it's wajib to see a doctor? And some of them actually said it's actually wajib to see a doctor unless you have the iman of Abu Bakr. So you can see things are often not black and white. Okay, and then we go through case studies, inshallah. So what is medical ethics? What is ethics? It's basically that branch of knowledge which tells us what is right and wrong, what is good and bad, what is right and wrong. How do you think we can decide things like what is right and wrong? Any ideas? Do you think human beings know innately what is good and bad? Say you aren't a Muslim, or say you are a Muslim. You're just a person. Do you think human beings know innately what is good and bad? Think so?
To an extent.
What do you mean to an extent?
Basic fundamental things that people know is right or wrong, but doesn't always extend as far as other perceptions.
So yeah, I think you have a point. So there may be some basic, there might be some things, this is what I feel, there may be some things that probably all people would agree. Like for example, killing another human being. Yeah, most societies would agree that that is bad or wrong, whether they are religious or not religious. Stealing another's property. But then again, someone may say, no, actually, what's the problem with that? What's the problem with killing? Or what's the problem with stealing? We're like animals, survival of the fittest, law of the jungle. What would you respond to that? Or do you think that's a valid stance to take? Sorry, I want to force you to speak today. Because otherwise I'm sure you're going to fall asleep because you've just eaten pizzas and you've had a long day. Any comments? anyone know what do Muslim theologians say about the issue? What would a Muslim theologian say about this issue? How do we know what's good and bad, you know?
That there is a divine revelation that defines what's right and what's wrong.
Yeah, good, yeah. So, okay, so I think that's on the next slide. So these are some different approaches that philosophers have mentioned. The one at the bottom is the one that applies to Muslims, supernaturalism. Supernaturalism makes it sound a bit exotic, and one of the challenges of our time is to actually take back the discourse, you know, because we've been the discourse has been taken out of our hands as Muslims, and it's in the hands of you know, mainly Western academia. So many terms we need to look back at, and because language is very important, how you term things is very important, you know. And you know the obvious things like war on terror, things like that, you know, why the way they define that term and made it almost impossible for people to talk about it without using that terminology, you know. Anyway, in any case, supernaturalism just means super above nature. So we're talking about metaphysical, you know, somewhere beyond nature is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the unseen, beyond this physical world. Right? So the only source of moral rules is God. This is what the majority of our theologians, and this is the standard position of our theologians, was that the only reason we know what is good or bad or right and wrong is because Allah has said something is good or bad or right and wrong. Yeah, because human beings may differ, like the examples I gave, you know. You might find human beings that come along and say, well, look, what's wrong with killing, what's wrong with you know, survival of the fittest, etc., appealing to evolution theory, etc. And then you have these other various approaches to ethics, which you'll find in the West, which has mainly, you know, abandoned religion and become very secular, with the exception of America, which remains quite a strong Christian evangelical fundamentalist movement within that country, and very influential, the Christian far right. But Europe is very much abandoned its Christian faith for some time now. So their ethics are based on, not now the Bible anymore, although you will see the influence of Christianity still within the ethical and moral systems of these people. But it's not, it's obviously now based on different philosophies. So you have virtue ethics, deontological, utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is probably what most characterizes the UK, the British philosophers. You've probably heard of people like humanists. They're basically atheists, but they say we're humanists. And their main philosophy is utilitarianism. So this is their sort of underlying philosophy. The greatest good is the decision which will bring benefit to the greatest number of people in society. Or as they often say, that which brings the most happiness to the most people is good. Alright? So you can see the obvious consequence of taking ethics away from a religious basis or a revelation is that it becomes changeable with time. As you can see in the UK, the dominant culture, things like homosexuality, which were once considered unfashionable or not allowed due to their Christian background, have now become acceptable and legislated. Any questions on that slide? Principalism is the base of Western medical ethics. This is probably stuff you've done during your medical degrees, I guess. Or if not, I'm sure you'll come across these 4 principles that are at the bottom of the page. this is what the GMC, the General Medical Council, will also publish and review as guidelines as practicing doctors in this country. So we respect patients' autonomy. In other words, if a patient says, sorry doctor, I don't want to have an operation to save my life, as long as he has capacity and he's sane, you can't really override that, even if you feel that he's going to die and you could save his life. Beneficence, acting in the best interest of the patient. Non-maleficence, avoid the causation of harm. This is a thorny topic in my opinion, but I won't sidetrack into it. But a lot of work being done on the harm that is actually caused by Western biomedicine. Yeah? Not probably the best audience to talk about this to, as you're all training to become doctors, but I think it's important to have an idea of this as well. Obviously there's great good that's done by doctors who have been trained in the Western biomedical system, but we don't forget the influence of multinational corporations, very powerful pharmaceutical companies, very powerful business interests that can influence governments. They influence funding in universities. They influence where research is carried out. Yeah? They have their bottom line, like all corporations and the whole business world, their bottom line is always, you know what the bottom line is. Now, obviously they will be glossing over their activities with things like, oh, we're really concerned about the environment, and pharmaceutical companies saying we want to help people by developing good medicines, etc. But you can't really take that seriously. We all know that what they want to do is make lots of money. If they can achieve a bit of good on the side, I'm sure there are good intentions there. I'm not saying they're all, shayateen or anything like that. But they're people. But the whole way the economic system is structured, the whole way the capitalist, usury-based global economic system is structured, is all geared towards making maximization of profits. And in fact, there's a good book if anyone wants to read on this subject called When Corporations Rule the World by a guy called Korten, K-O-R-T-E-N. He was actually a big guy within the corporate world, CEO, etc., all of that stuff. And then he turned into like one of these anti-globalist activists. And he describes how the system is structured in such a way that even if you did have a particular corporation that, let's say, the leadership wanted to become more ethical and more, more fair to their employees, etc., the system is structured in such a way that they would then become the victim of a hostile takeover. Hostile takeover. What that means is, if a company is not working to its full maximization of profits, in other words, because it wants to give consideration to ethical concerns, it sacrifices its profits, which it would have to do. If you want to take care of your workers, say in Britain, and you don't want to sack thousands of people and open up a factory in Bangladesh, where you get cheap labor, but you want to keep your employees in say, Britain, you're going to have to sacrifice your profits. We're not talking about making a loss. We're talking about reduction of profits for one of these massive companies like BP or something like that. But simply a reduction of profits, that would lead to then within the market system and the stocks and shares system, it can easily lead to then a hostile takeover of the company. A hostile takeover means it's done against the wishes of the actual leadership of that company. So there are actually other companies out there that is their job and their role is to identify those companies which are not maximizing their profits and then take them over in a hostile takeover bid, and then they will radically then cut down, they will then take those measures that they believe are required. So anyway, that's a slight digression, but it is really important for us to be aware of the world we live in. particularly for you guys, actually, as you know, as you may be aware, Islamic law, Islamic scholarship is in somewhat of a crisis because of the brain drain that has taken place away from people studying Islam and going into other areas such as medicine and other things which became more highly regarded and more profitable. So this, in the last few generations, Muslim societies around the world have suffered from this brain drain, where people are no longer going into studying Islam. And our scholars have talked about that, as you may be aware. So, particularly the things we're going to talk about today, you know, the giving of fatwa, the ijtihad, when we have to give new rulings on issues that have never arisen before. Who are the people that can issue those rulings? What's their qualifications? They have to have three fundamental attributes. First of all, a deep and wide knowledge of Islam, meaning the Islamic sources, etc. Secondly, they have to be people of high intelligence. Because, you know, if you memorize a huge amount of material, you might have memorized loads of material, but if you don't have the actual intelligence to apply that, and you know, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given people different abilities, and it's not wrong to say that certain people have more intelligence than others. Although it may become slightly taboo in this culture, in this society that we live in, because of, and this is another interesting digression, which I'm just reminding myself not to go into interesting digressions. But Western societies like the ones we live in, since the Nazi atrocities of the Second World War, it's become taboo to have any type of biological differentiation, or, you know, to imply that there's a difference between, for example, different races or between different people has become a taboo because of that extreme that the Nazis went to when they started identifying certain sectors of their population and wiping them out. So the Western culture and society that we live in have their own hang-ups, they have their own psychological issues, which we as Muslims living in the West need to study as well. So good, you know, to go into anthropology, if you can, read up in anthropology, because anthropologists have now turned to studying Western culture as well. Anthropologists used to study exotic Eastern, but now they've turned their gaze back into the Western culture itself. So anyway, the point being here that to be aware of the world we live in, we need people like yourselves to study Islam as well. Because for people to give fatwa, for someone to say, is abortion permitted in certain circumstances? Is organ transplantation permitted? Right? As you'll see later on, there's conflict of evidences in the sources. This requires a deep and wide knowledge and an intelligence. Yeah? We have to have intelligent people. And thirdly, they need to have a spiritual insight. So they need a degree of purification as well. All three elements are vital for the production of fatwa. And people often nowadays will neglect thinking about the third aspect, but it is vital. If you look at the early great imams of this ummah, you will see that in their biographies they are always praised for their piety and their scrupulousness, first of all, as well as their knowledge and as well as their intelligence. So all three of these ingredients are vital. Now if we have this brain drain, and we have all of you guys going off and studying medicine, and we don't have people studying Islam, that's a problem. So all of you inshallah ta'ala should become ulama in the future. And don't think because you're doing medicine or dentistry or whatever you can't also study Islam. Some of our greatest scholars have been physicians in the past and in the present. Shaykh Abul Yusr Abidin was one of the great last mufti of Sham, of Damascus, where I studied. He's a teacher of our teachers. He was a physician. He was a fully qualified doctor, and he was the Mufti of Sham. Sheikh Samir al-Nas, one of the great scholars of Syria, younger scholars of Syria today, who some of you may have heard of. He's also a doctor. You know, he opens up his clinic during the day and he's teaching Islam in the evenings. So don't, you know, we need people like you guys to be studying Islam. Okay, I'm not going to go through the slides. I'll just give you the meanings of them. Yeah? Islamic medical ethics is significantly underdeveloped. Yeah? So there's works that needs to be done, especially with all of the new, you know, just a massive stream of new things that are coming up in this modern society that just haven't been addressed. Yeah? There's issues coming up all the time, so we need people who are trained as doctors, medics, and also trained in the Islamic sciences and are able to look at those issues with intelligence and with this spiritual insight. So as we said, you know, if you look down at point number 3, our ethics are based on revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No matter how times change, how human opinions change, we don't change. The Quran remains the same as it was, the Hadith remain the same as they were. No matter if all of the other human beings are saying to us, oh, homosexuality is fine, we're going to say no. The Quran has told us it's not fine. Now, you know, just to, obviously, on the other hand, we shouldn't have the approach that some slightly crazy Muslims you've seen out there on the media have, you know, very sort of hostile attitude towards homosexuality, etc. It's not really appropriate, especially we being living within this culture. And to be honest, it's not really based on Islam. We're not hostile towards people for what sins they commit. You know, so if you know someone who commits that particular sin, we don't, you know, we ask Allah to forgive them, we ask Allah to guide them. Yeah? Just like any other major sin that someone might be committing. Okay. And as some people may not be aware, you know, it's so widely sort of spoken about amongst the Muslim community that the death penalty is to be served upon homosexuality in Islam. That's not actually strictly correct. The penalty for homosexuality is not laid down in the hudud, which are the very few criminal punishments that are actually specified within the Quran and the Hadith. The punishment for homosexuality is at the discretion of the qadi or the judge. So he will give a punishment according to the circumstances, the society, etc. The maximum punishment he can give is a capital punishment, but he may give any punishment up to that level. And in fact, the qadi, the least, one of the punishments he can give, mentioned in the books of fiqh, is to just give a stern look, or just to tell the person off. That's also considered ta'zir. That's considered a punishment in Islamic law. Now I see some people smiling and laughing as if, well, that's not, what sort of punishment is that, you know, just giving a stern look. But, you know, it just shows how different our society is now from the past. You know, if you think back to the old days when people lived in communities, you know, everyone knows everyone, people in villages, towns, even, you know, even in towns and cities, everyone knows everyone, neighborhoods. You know, it's very local. You know, like Brother Ubada was mentioning about sphere of influence. Think back in those days, before there was TV, before there was internet, before there was mobile phones, before there was phones, before there was radios. All of this has come about in the modern age, within the last 150 to 200 years. So for thousands of years, human beings, imagine how they lived. They didn't have communication with the wider world. You know, you basically knew what was happening in your neighborhood, in your village, in your town. But what's happening in the neighboring town, you wouldn't know unless someone travels, which may often be several days' journey. So people were very much aware of their own neighbors, their society that they lived in, their local community. So for someone to just come in front of the qadi and be found guilty of something, that would be enough of a shame to actually be enough of a punishment within that society. So the Qadi often will just tell the person off and say, don't do it again. But because of the shame that he's experienced amongst his community, that would actually be a punishment. See, I should have warned you beforehand, if you don't interact, then I could just talk and go for a lot of tangents. So please, speak. Okay, so the third point, second sub-point is quite important. Revelation, wahi. We follow revelation. We don't follow reason or intellect if it conflicts with revelation. And this is actually one of the standard, or one of the defining rules of the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the Sunni community historically, as opposed to the Mu'tazilites. The Mu'tazilites were people who were very influenced by Greek philosophy, to the point where they would say, that reason is the foundation of Islam. And if they found that revelation conflicted against what they felt was their rational conclusions on anything, they would tend to discard the revelation and go with reason. Now obviously they wouldn't discard the revelation, meaning they wouldn't deny the verse of Quran in question, but they would put a different interpretation on it, that would be in accordance with their... Because if they denied the revelation altogether, they wouldn't be Muslim. But they were considered a Muslim, but a deviant sect of ultra-rationalists. Very good to study for people who are interested, because that same influence of Greek philosophy that came into Islam at that time, and our scholars and the Muslims as an ummah dealt with it and responded to it. The same influence came into Europe in what they call the Enlightenment period, and it actually led to the demise of Christianity in Europe. But it didn't lead to the demise of Islam when it came into the Islamic world. It actually led to the strengthening and the flourishing of Islam, as it then responded, the theologians responded to what we call the philosophers, the philosopher, etc. So, this whole idea of rationality has been extensively, beyond what you can imagine, discussed between theologians, Muslim philosophers, because you had some philosophers that were still Muslim, like Ibn Sina, etc., although people may debate or discuss whether they consider him to be within the fold of Islam, etc. So, revelation is a manifestation of guidance, mercy, and rationality. The first two, I guess there's no controversy about guidance and mercy. The Quran describes itself as hudan lil muttaqeen. It's a guidance for believers, and a mercy, the Prophet ﷺ is a mercy to all creation, etc. But the third one, it needs to be slightly put into context, rationality. So the relationship between revelation and reason or rationality is something that we need to study when we study Aqidah, which means doctrine or theology. So if people haven't studied their basic Aqidah, it is very important for you to do so. It's fard ayn. It's an individual obligation upon every Muslim to study their basic Aqidah, to study their basic fiqh, which means the rules of your personal ibadat. How do I do wudu? How do I do ghusl? How do I pray? How do I pay my zakat? Anything that you have to do, you have to learn how to do. So you have to study. But the Aqidah is absolutely essential. So if people haven't studied, please take the opportunities to find somewhere where they're offering basic course in Aqidah, like we have in Hounslow, West London. In fact, next Tuesday we're starting a beginner's Aqidah course. So anyone who's interested is welcome to attend. You can go in the tube, get off at Hounslow Central, and it's 5 minutes walk from the tube station. It's West London School of Islamic Studies. You can just Google it, and the course starts. It's a 14-week course on basic belief, Aqidah, that Muslims have to believe in. So the rationality, anyone got any comments about rationality? Do you agree that Islam is based on rationality?
conflicted with the sources.
And I think if we don't understand the rationality, it's probably because it's beyond us, but there is a rationality that comes under it.
Good, yeah. Okay, yeah. I would generally agree with that. But then what about the, anyone got any other viewpoint on that? The famous incident of, famous statement of Sayyidina Ali? Wiping over socks? Does that ring any bells? You know the wiping over socks when you do wudu? You're allowed to wipe over thick leather socks or thick socks that are waterproof. I don't want to go, obviously I don't want to go into a different opinion about that, but the wiping over the sock is you wipe over the top of the sock. Right? You wipe over the top of the sock. And Ali who is famously known to have said, if Islam was based on reason, we would have wiped over the bottom of the sock. So this is what I mean about, you know, there's a sort of, we have to be careful. We're not like the Mu'tazilites who said reason is everything. There are limits on reason. There are limits on reason and limits on the human intellect. Okay? We're not God. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one of the greatest gifts He gave us was the aql, the intellect. You know, we don't often reflect upon these things. But there are limits to the intellect as well. You know, there are places where reason can break down. There are places where logic can break down. There are what they call logical paradoxes. You know, if you study logic, you'll find that logic, you know, most people think logic is a fail-safe, you know, foolproof system of analyzing things, you know. It's a part of reason, I would say. Logic is a part of reason, you know, the wider thing. But logic can break down in certain places. The classical example they give, one of the examples they give, is the teacher who wants to set an exam. So imagine your professors come along and said, you're going to have an exam next week, right? You're going to have an exam next week in anatomy, right? But I'm only going to give you 24 hours notice for the exam. Yeah? Now, when you start looking at this logically, the thing breaks down because, let's say it's a 7-day week, you know, so you could have an exam any day, Monday to Sunday. But I said I'll only tell you 1 day in advance. Now, if it comes to Friday, right, and he hasn't announced it, you'll know that the exam must be on Sunday, right? So, in other words, he can't leave it till Sunday. Does everyone follow that? This is probably the wrong time of day, and a lot of pizza and people suffer. So he can't actually technically leave it till Sunday because then you'll have 48 hours notice. But then, by the same thinking, he can't leave it till Saturday either. Because by the time it comes to Thursday morning and he hasn't announced it, you'll know it can't be Sunday, so it must be Saturday. And so on and so forth. So there's actually, when you look at it with the eye of logic, formal logic, it's actually impossible for him to set an exam and give 24 hours notice. And then you can apply the same thing to a month. So you could say in the following month, I'll give you just 24 hours notice to set an exam. But technically, logically, he cannot do that. But we know for a fact, in reality, he can. He could just come along any day of the month and say, tomorrow you'll have your exam. So that's an example of what they call a logical paradox. Something just to think about tonight when you're at home in bed. You probably won't be able to get to sleep until you get to the bottom of it. Get hold of a book on introductory logic. But well, you can't get to the bottom of it because it's a paradox. It's actually where logic breaks down. So my point here is just that, you know, the aql is limited in certain ways. And the Mi'raj of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you know, was also a sign of the limit of the intellect. So the Sidratul Muntaha, the log tree of the furthest boundary, which is mentioned in the Quran, scholars have interpreted as symbolizing the extent of human reason and human aql. So beyond that point where the Prophet ﷺ went into the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he goes into a place that is beyond the human intellect. So he goes into a place where he sees Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but it can only be done by the power of the spirit. It's not something that the minds can grasp. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu said, كُلُّ مَا خَطَرَ فِي بَالِكَ فَاللَّهُ غَيْرُ ذَلِكَ. Everything that occurs in your mind, Allah is not like that. Okay? Anything that occurs in your mind, Allah is not like that. So the human brain, the aql, has been made incapable of grasping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And obviously that makes sense, because if you could have complete knowledge of Allah, you would then have mastered Him. And it's impossible to master or dominate Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even in common language, we say when someone masters any particular subject or field of knowledge, we say they've mastered, they've mastered that thing. So you can't master Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that all comes into Aqidah. So just want to expand a bit about, take the rationality. Yes, many of our scholars did say the Sharia is based on reason. The Sharia is based on reason. And actually some scholars wrote books to look at what are the rationale behind different things in the Sharia. One of the early books was a scholar called Al-Hakim Al-Tirmidhi, who wrote on the Hikam. I think it's called Hikam. It's called Al-Hikam. The Hikam, the wisdoms behind the Sharia. So look at different rulings and the wisdoms. And then one of the later scholars who did this was Shah Waliullah Dahlawi from India. Shah Waliullah was one of the greatest scholars of the 19th century, I believe he was. He lived at a time when the British and the Europeans were gaining a lot of ascendancy over Muslims. So in a way, his work was slightly reactionary to this European ideals of the Enlightenment and reason and all of these philosophies that they were coming and bedazzling the Muslim world. So he then wrote his book Hujjatullah al-Baligha to sort of show all of the philosophy and the wisdoms behind Islamic law.
Earlier you mentioned Ibn Sina, who was a doctor himself, being someone who tried to combine Islamic theology and rationale. Why do you think that's not accepted by some people, the way he tried to do it?
It's a good question, a deep question. It's a case of, I think, it's sort of like a balance or a middle way. You have revelation on one side, and then you have this whole rational philosophical tradition within Islam as well. And there's extremes on both sides. There was another extreme of our scholars, theologians, who actually completely rejected the whole of theology. They're sometimes known as the Hadith, Ahlul Hadith, etc. They basically said, it's what we call kalam theology, the science of theology. They said we should have nothing to do with it. We should not debate anything. Islam has got nothing to do with rationality or reason. We strictly stick to revelation. We've got the Quran and the Sunnah. You've probably heard, people even today having that similar type of approach. We've got the Quran and the Hadith. We don't need anything else. So we don't need the Greek philosophy. We don't need reason, etc. That's quite on one side a bit extreme as well. And then, like I mentioned, you had some Muslim scholars who went quite to an extreme to the other side, and they really said reason is the basis of everything, and we have to go with what reason dictates. So the philosophers tend to fall into that camp, like Ibn Sina. They tend to fall into that. They consider to fall into that camp. What the majority of Muslim theologians did was they took a sort of a middle way. So they responded to the philosophers. And to respond to them, they had to respond by using their own, by using their methods. You can't. The one response of the Ahlul Hadith was just, our response is no response. Our response is we don't engage. But to many people, that can be quite unsatisfactory, because part of what my understanding of theology is to respond to the challenges of the time. Like today, we have evolution theory. We have different challenges. So always Islam has always responded to challenges, and you can't. To respond to the philosophers, you have to start arguing with them on certain premises. So our theologians, like Imam al-Ash'ari is one of the first. and one of the greatest of the theologians. He himself was a Mu'tazilite first. So he was one of those rationalist philosopher types for many years. And at some point he had a conversion moment. He actually had a dream of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, which was quite, I think, quite amazing in itself. Something I think actually if people, someone at some point has an interest, there needs to be a study done on this. The actual intervention of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in dreams throughout our history. It's really interesting. I mean, there's quite a few cases you'll come across of very pivotal figures in our history, in our intellectual history, and in our political history, that somehow their orientation or life has changed because of a dream of the Prophet ﷺ. So that influence of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ taking place, after his death throughout our history, because he can come to us in dreams, you see. Shah Waliullah is another example. He actually first had a different approach, and he was advocating the abandoning of all 4 schools of law. And then he had a dream of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, also that changed his orientation. Imam al-Ashari is another example. So Imam al-Ashari then, he left the Mu'tazilites and he came into the fold of the Sunni Islam, and he then started debating back the Mu'tazilites. So he was using a lot of their own premises in rationality, logic, etc. And that was developed later by many other scholars. So Ibn Sina, people have to draw their own conclusions by reading his works. I haven't read him extensively, so I can't really give any judgments. I've read small parts of what he wrote, and to me, actually, he proves that there is a God, etc. So I didn't personally see the kufr, but there may be other things I haven't read that he's written on. Did that sort of answer the question, or is there anything further? So we started at 2, didn't we? Let's whiz through a few things. This is actually very important, I think, for us to appreciate what is fiqh, what is Islamic law, how has it come about. Yeah? During the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, there was no fatwa, there was no ijtihad, because the Prophet ﷺ himself was able to give direct response to any issue that arose, and he would get that through revelation. Although, having said that, there was some occasions where some Sahaba were sent away from Medina, and they were actually told, if certain issues arise, how would you deal with them if you can't access the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ directly? But generally speaking, any issues that arose, people could come back to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ directly, and they could get, he would tell them straight away, so if someone, for example, had a nosebleed, and he thinking, have I broken my wudu? Right? He doesn't have to make a ijtihad or anything. He just comes to the Prophet ﷺ and says to him, I had a nosebleed, is my wudu broken? The Prophet ﷺ will tell him the answer. But however, following the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ passing away, what do we do when we want to know what's the answer to a particular question? And the answer is not to be found in the Quran or the Hadith that we have. Because new issues arise all the time. New issues arise all the time. So you might not find a verse of Quran or a Hadith. What do you do? Yeah? So if you go down to the where it says fiqh rulings, people would go to the Sahaba, the great Sahaba, like Umar ibn al-Khattab. After Umar ibn al-Khattab, his son, Abdullah ibn Umar. People would go to Sayyidah Aisha. People would go to Anas ibn Malik. People would go to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. People would go to Sayyidina Ali. These were the great Sahaba who had the most knowledge of legal matters, of legal rulings that people would go to. They wouldn't go to every Sahaba, because just because you're Sahaba doesn't mean that you've got a wide and deep knowledge of the Quran and the Hadith and the Sunnah, and you're able to give legal verdicts. So there were actually specifically known Sahaba that people would go to. Yeah. Some Sahaba may have spent one day with the Prophet ﷺ. Yeah. So there were certain Sahaba, and then there were certain Sahaba that had a lot of knowledge, for example in Hadith, but were not necessarily experts in giving fatwa, in ijtihad, in legal verdicts. Yeah. So for example, Abu Hurairah, he's the greatest narrator of Hadith, but he wasn't one of those that was known for giving fatwa specifically amongst the Sahaba. Then after the Sahaba passed away, where would people go if they need to find out what's the ruling? They can't find it in the Quran, they can't find it in the Hadith, and they can't find any Sahaba that have given a ruling on that matter. What do? They would go to the students of the Sahaba. So this is what we call the Tabi'een generation. So people like Al-Hasan al-Basri, who's mentioned there, is of that second generation. And so on, it continues. So this is a tradition that comes from the Prophet ﷺ to the Sahaba, to his... And the reason why I'm stressing this, because people do often become very confused when we start talking about the Sunni schools of law, like the Hanafi school, the Maliki school, etc. People often think, where does this come from? Where have these schools come from? Why were these people giving all these rulings about different matters? What's the precedent for that? So it's very important to appreciate that this is not something new, that Abu Hanifa certainly came along and started making rulings and ijtihad, and qiyas. This was something that was done by his teachers, by their teachers who were students of Sahaba, and by the Sahaba themselves. So this is an unbroken tradition. And it makes sense because you can imagine there's always questions. People who are becoming Muslim, Islam is spreading around the whole world. People are becoming Muslim, they've got lots of questions. Oh, the mouse just fell into the well. The mouse, can I do wudu from that well? Is the water still clean? Is it now najis? If it is najis, how do I sort it out? You won't find a hadith about it. You won't find it in the Quran.
When there are differing opinions on things like that, so when someone, for example, is giving a fatwa, how do you know what is correct? How do you know whether
very good question. Very good question. So, obviously that is going to come later, but I'll just briefly mention that, because that's the question that will come up. So when you come after the Sahaba, when you come to issues, there may be difference of opinions. Yeah. So depending on how we understand the sources, the Quran and the Hadith, we may have a difference of opinion. Like the thing I mentioned about nosebleeds. If you went to Abu Hanifa and his students, they would say that your wudu is broken. But if you went to Imam Shafi and his students, they would say, no, your wudu is not broken by a nosebleed. So these difference of opinion can come about because there's no clear Quran or Hadith text. Obviously, if there's a clear text of Quran or Hadith, there can be no room for difference of opinion. But to be honest, for 90% of the masail that come up, there's no clear text directly dealing with it. Because the issues are vast. If you look at the books of Islamic law, the issues are vast. There's all different types of scenarios come in, so the text don't directly deal with them. So what do we do when we have a difference of opinion? Now, there's different approaches to that as well. So there's difference of opinion about what you do about difference of opinion, I'm afraid. Just to confuse things more. So you'll find some scholars who will say you have to just choose one school of law and follow it, and unless you yourself become a scholar of a high enough stature to do your own ijtihad or make your own fatwas, if you're a non-specialist, in other words, in giving fatwa, you just have to pick one school of law or one mufti that you trust, and you follow them for everything. Okay. That approach doesn't necessarily appeal much to people nowadays when we're living in what we call an information age, right? Because people are very quickly getting fatwas from all over the place about things, and they don't really feel, they might not feel very happy doing that. But that's probably, for someone who's not studied Islam at all or very little, the safest thing for them to do is follow one particular school of law, learn the rulings, how do I do my tahara, salah, all of that. If you have any new questions that come up, like that have not been addressed in books of law, ask someone you trust, a scholar that you trust that has studied properly in a recognized madrasa or institution. You know, they've got a good qualification. Ask them, whatever they tell you, that's what you have to follow, and your responsibility is off your head on the Day of Judgment. The responsibility goes on that person. Because he's the mufti or he's the scholar, so it's his responsibility. So as my scholar, my teachers in Damascus, they have a saying, Al-Ami ala Deen Mufti. The non-specialist or the non-scholar is upon the deen of his mufti. So whichever is that scholar that you trust, first of all in his knowledge, qualification, but also his piety, you know. You want people that, not, you know, they're not be angelic in character, but people who are generally upright and, you know, you can trust them. You would go to them, you know. That's probably what I can say. Sometimes where you have a difference of opinion, you might find a consensus emerging in new issues. I'm talking about now, new issues. So things that haven't been dealt in the past, say organ transplants, etc. You might have a bit of difference of opinion, but then as years go by, you might find a consensus emerging, you know, amongst the scholars. And where you see that consensus emerging, that can be a safe place also to follow as well. Any more specific questions on that? Or? It's quite hard to answer. Like I said, the difference of opinion. Some are more strict about following just one school, whereas some, you know, obviously there's a lot of people now that say completely don't follow any school of law within the Muslims. Quite a big movement where you know, so there's actually another side which says all four schools, we shouldn't follow them. We should now follow directly the Quran and the Hadith. The problem with that is you have to have quite a lot of knowledge of the Quran and the Hadith to do that in the first place. So really what you're ending up doing is following another scholar who's got a lot of knowledge about Quran and Hadith.
What about the school that says, well, I don't know if there's really a school, people who say that you should only follow the Quran itself as the sole law of the Quran?
Yeah, exactly. So there's people now that say just follow just the Quran. That actually is not considered to be within Islam. That's actually considered kufr, if you actually believe that. I'm sure you know, obviously, but you're asking about other people. Why? Because the Quran itself says, Ati Allah wa Ati Rasul. Obey Allah and obey His Messenger. In many places, you know, and whatever the Messenger has brought, then you have to take it. So the Quran itself commands us to follow the Messenger of Allah. And how do we do that if we're not going to follow the Hadith, which are Sahih, which are, you know, that are verified? I think one of the problems with that movement, probably they put doubt on the Hadith. They probably put doubt on whether we can be sure of the authenticity of the Hadith. But this is, you know, problematic because we actually can have a lot of faith in the authenticity of Hadith, which are Sahih, a high degree of faith. You know, so we have to study the science of Hadith and how Hadith are categorized into Sahih, Hasan, Da'if, etc. to really appreciate the huge work that our scholars put in at a very early stage of Islam to make sure that the Hadith could be verified and authenticated, that they are from the Prophet ﷺ. You know? Once again, I don't think we have time to go into that digression in a big way, but that's a brief answer to that. Yeah. Those people who claim to follow just the Quran, they're putting doubts in people about the Hadith, but those doubts are unfounded. You know, we need to start. You know, you need to study with scholars, sit with scholars, and find out how the Hadith science is developed. And so you have the four schools of law. Historically, Sunni Islam was defined as the four schools of law: the Hanafi, Shafi, Hanbali, Maliki. As I mentioned, in the last century or two, quite a large movement arose amongst the Muslims to abandon the following of the four schools of law and go directly to the sources. So that can be put under an umbrella term, la madhhabiyya, the non-madhhabist approach to Sharia. Today is not a place to go into that debate either, but I'm just giving an overview without taking either side. That the instigator of this movement was a historical person called Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab from the Najd in Saudi Arabia, and he basically identified that within the Muslims there are a lot of bad practices, what we call innovations, and he felt that also, as a corollary to that, he also felt that the following of the four schools, the Sunni schools of law, had gone a bit extreme, or people had become fanatic, which was probably true, because like for example in Syria where I studied, you had, in the mosque you have 4 different mihrabs, one for each school of law. In the Umayyad, if you've been to the Umayyad mosque, anyone, in Damascus, you'll see there's 4 mihrabs. That was because they used to have a Maliki Imam, Hanafi, Shafi and Hanbali. So they used to have 4 different jamaats for the 4 different schools of law, which is obviously gone, taking things a bit extreme, and you're splitting up. Yeah, but that's not what the majority of people who follow those schools of law believe you should do. Anyhow, so he started this movement about going back to what he called going back to the Quran and Sunnah. Yeah. So that was in the 19th century. He allied himself politically to the Saudi family. They actually took power from the Ottomans over Arabia. But the first time they did that, the Ottomans sent their general from Egypt, and he actually defeated them, and so he took back the land back for the Ottoman Empire. Then the second time, the line of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and the Saudi, because they made this alliance that went through generations. The lineage of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab would be the religious authority, and the lineage of the Saudi would be the political authority. So when they came into power, then they were defeated by the Ottomans, and the land was taken back to the Ottomans. Then after the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire was dismantled by the European powers in 1924, the Saudis, you've heard of Lawrence of Arabia and all that, that was part of that Arab revolt against the Ottomans. Yeah? So this resulted then in the Saudis coming back into power in Arabia and establishment of what's now called Saudi Arabia. One of the things they had is they don't follow madhabs. Although actually now many of them follow they follow the Hanbali madhab. And this is quite a recent change. Some of them always did follow the Hanbali madhab, because the Hanbali madhab is very much based on hadith, following hadith anyway, Quran and hadith. But in recent years, especially post 9/11, where there was quite a big criticism from the West, so a political pressure put upon the Saudis that they were accused of following an extreme version of Islam and creating all these jihadists and fanatics. So they've actually softened up, and many of them are now saying they've gone back to following Hanbali madhab. The other major stream that went against following madhabs came a bit later, in the beginning of the 20th century. In Al-Azhar, you had a line of scholars, started off by Afghani, and then his student Muhammad Abdu, who became the principal of Al-Azhar, and then his student Rashid Rida, who also was the principal of Al-Azhar. They started quite a large movement of also saying that, you know, the madhabs, the 4 schools of law, they've become very backward. They're unable to respond to the challenges of the time. We need to have a fresh ijtihad. We need to go back to the Quran and the Sunnah. So these were 2 streams that have contributed and come to our present time, where now we find the Muslim Ummah divided between those who still follow those traditional 4 schools of law. Some are more fanatic in them, and then others within that group itself. The teachers I studied with were not really fanatic in sticking to, you know, one school of law. They were more, because most of the scholars I studied